Welcome, everyone. Hi, I'm Melissa Scanlon. I'm the director of the Environmental Law Center, and you are here in our Summer Hot Topics lecture series. We meet here every Tuesday and Thursday from noon to 1, and so if you're new to this series, welcome. For those of you who've been coming for years and getting free CLE credits, you know the drill of signing in the back. This is going to be about a half-an-hour lecture followed by a question and answer period, and then we'll get you out of here about 5 minutes to 1, so those who have afternoon classes can get to their classes. I'm really pleased to welcome Gabriel Eckstein. He is a professor of law at Texas A&M, and he is our 2016 Distinguished International Environmental Law Scholar. So we're very pleased to have him here for the next 2 weeks. And he's kicking off his 2 weeks with this lecture, and you'll all love it, and then you're going to want to set up meetings with him. So I'm sorry about that, but you will have a delegate of people. So in addition to the law faculty at Texas A&M, he also serves on the graduate faculty, the Texas A&M Water Management and Hydrological Science Program, and the Texas A&M Energy Institute. He directs the internet-based International Water Law Project. He serves as the associate editor for Brill Research Perspectives, International Water Law, and he's on the editorial board of the Journal of Water. He has widely published in this area of international water law, among other topics, and he served as an expert advisor and consultant for various UN agencies, non-governmental organizations, and other groups in the US and internationally on water and climate issues. He was recently appointed to chair the International Scientific Committee for the next World Water Congress, which will be held in Cancun, Mexico in May 2017. So mark your calendars and get ready to go to Mexico. Along with his JD, Professor Eckstein holds an LLM in International Environmental Law, an MS in International Affairs, and a BA in Geology. And he also, if that weren't enough, serves as hub counsel with the law firm of Sullivan in Worcester. So today he's going to be speaking to us about international water law. The topic is From Science to Law, Transboundary Groundwater Resources and Emerging International Law. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eckstein.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you for the Vermont Law School for having me here. This is a really wonderful opportunity for me here to come up and engage with all of you, engage with all the other wonderful scholars that you have here locally and the folks you bring in. And I really appreciate this opportunity to be part of this. Now, Melissa said this is going to be a half-hour presentation. Like any good professor, I've got a good 3 hours. I'm going to try to cram into this half hour or so. So let me get started. The focus, what I want to be talking about is on international water law, but focusing on groundwater resources, and particularly transboundary aquifers. And the reason why this is, to me, such a big deal, we are at the cusp of, we can watch this, the international law is evolving right in front of us, and we're at the very beginning stage. We're seeing the law being thought out, tested, created for transboundary aquifers. And this is rather exciting because we've never had law in this area, and we desperately need it. And so my presentation, I'm going to go through a couple different portions in terms of what I'm going to talk about, but the real focus here is on the idea that law is evolving on the international level, talk about what the bases are. I'm going to infuse some science in it because I'm hoping that the law evolves from a sound science approach, which is something I've been working on for a while. And this is something that I hope evolves in that direction. And like I said, it's a really exciting area because UN agencies are involved, governments are involved, countries, virtually every country in the world. And if you think about it, with the exception of some of those island nations, every country in the world is hydrologically connected to another. And it's almost always through groundwater. So it's a big deal. So that's what I'm going to be talking about to kick this off, I'm going to ask you guys a couple questions. What's groundwater? And by the way, since this is a law school, right? So we're in a legal community. From a legal point of view, what is groundwater?
A river.
Is it a river? Is it an underground river?
Can be.
What else? What else do you think? You think groundwater. What do you think about? Yeah.
Water that's underground.
Water that's underground. Is it all water that's underground?
No.
The reason I'm pushing, I want you to think about this, because from a legal point of view, you're going to be the regulators, you're going to be the lawyers, you're going to be the judges. What is this thing that we're talking about that we want to manage or regulate?
Movement of water.
Movement of water. What if the water is not moving?
Then you've got to wait, and that's another.
Well, so should we apply surface water? You described it in terms of lakes and rivers. Should we apply surface water law? Just plop that law right down on the ground, or underground, so to speak. These are sort of the questions we have to think about when we're talking about groundwater. And I'll talk a little bit about science here. Groundwater, it's water that's in the voids, in space. And so somebody mentioned all water underground. If you look at this diagram here, we've got a saturated area, and we've got a wet area that's not saturated. If you think of a fish tank, fill it up with sand all the way to the top. Take a pitcher, pour water into it. You can see on the side of that fish tank the water level going up, right? Everything below will be saturated. The stuff above it will be wet, but it won't be saturated. If you took a straw in there and tried to suck out that water, where would you be able to get water from? Well, the saturated part. But the unsaturated is still wet. Can we regulate it? Can we match? If we can't suck it out, can we do anything with it? Well, these are the kinds of things that you have to start thinking about when we're talking about groundwater and management and regulation. And I'm just going to throw some other ideas here. Where is this water stored in? Well, we call these aquifers. What is an aquifer? Well, technically, it's that matrix, the formation that holds the groundwater. So should we regulate the water or the formation that holds it? Well, if we don't have the formation, how can we have the water in the formation? If we destroy the formation, you can't put water into it. But that's not regulating the water, that's regulating rock, so to speak. This is the kind of things you have to start thinking about when you talk about water law, and certainly water law underground. Where does it get recharged? Well, should we regulate the area of recharge? Where does it discharge? Where does the water come out of the ground? You've seen springs, right? Natural springs, that kind of water emanating. That's the discharge zone of an aquifer. Should we regulate it? Should we control it? Should we manage it? How should we do it? I have to start thinking about all the information and the science and all those kinds of things that, you know, in terms of what do we do? What do we tell a person in terms of what you can and can't do with that water? This is the kind of things you have to start thinking about in terms of groundwater regulation. So I'm just throwing out examples or a diagram here. You've got a saturated zone. This stuff up here doesn't mean that doesn't have water. If it infiltrates through here, it's wet, but it's just not saturated. You may have droplets of water in there, but you can't pump out of there, but it's still wet. Can you control it? Oh, by the way, what if somebody dumps pollution over here? Well, if water can infiltrate, I'm sure some kind of chemical substance can infiltrate through that area, that recharge area. So again, you have to start thinking about what do we want to regulate and control when we're talking about groundwater. Well, okay, so we have the water itself, we have the formation, we have a recharge area, we have a discharge area. we're not done yet. We have unconfined aquifers and confined aquifers. And that's basically the big difference for our purposes. Confined aquifers, they're sandwiched between two layers of material that's not permeable. So they have a recharge somewhere, but they're sandwiched in between here of these confining layers. You know what an artesian aquifer? Have you ever seen an aquifer? You just put a well in there and it just flows out under pressure. That's a confined aquifer. The pressure built up between these confining layers, as well as the thousands and thousands of tons of dirt and rock and gravel above it, is squeezing this formation. And when you put a hole in it, a well, it'll spew over the top, depending on how much pressure you have in the aquifer. Should we regulate that differently than an unconfined aquifer that, well, the water level is going to go, there's no pressure, or the pressure is low enough, it's not going to go up above the land surface or to a certain elevation. It's only going to go to the top of the saturated area, the water table. We regulate that differently. And next couple slides, I just have some definitions. And by the way, you guys can have my slides. You're welcome to, and I'll leave them here. I'll pass them out to Melissa. But just some definitions, just some ideas in terms of how we define these different concepts. I'm not going to go through these in detail. We kind of talked about them in the diagrams. Let me give you one more here that I think is really interesting. Recharging and non-recharging aquifers. Okay, recharging aquifer, that's the aquifer that receives rain, or precipitation that infiltrates into the ground and recharges that reservoir. Non-recharging doesn't get that rain. Why? There's no rain. So America Southwest, the Ogallala Aquifer, which is across the whole central U.S., most of the aquifers in northern Africa, Middle East, there's just not enough rain to infiltrate the soil before it evaporates from the heat and recharge that aquifer, which means if you pump that aquifer, you're depleting it. Automatic immediate depletion. Should we regulate that any differently than a recharging aquifer? That's another major issue. Discharge zone, recharge zone, and let me make this more complicated. Internationally now, everything I talked about up until now, it applies to all groundwater, wherever it's located. At the international level, what we're seeing is, especially since World War II, when we developed pumping technology, and now up until World War II, we were able to dig wells, 50, 100 feet. If you get some good laborers, maybe 150 feet. We now can drill miles down into the ground and find deeper aquifers. As a result, our dependence on groundwater has increased exponentially since the 1950s, to the point where today about half of humanity relies on groundwater for their daily basic needs. Irrigation for crops, agriculture, it's about 20 or 30% worldwide. Groundwater for agriculture, for irrigation, and so on. So as a percent of irrigation, surface water is still the major source, but it's slowly shifting. We are pumping more and more every day. When we started from virtually nothing, not nothing, because there are places around the world, Middle East and so on, that have been relying on groundwater for generations. But the rates at which we're pumping today are exponential. This is an example. This is India. They're one of the countries that have really hit groundwater heavy. But obviously, India is one of the countries that has one of the greatest population growths in the world. Some other countries here, China, US, Bangladesh, really hitting groundwater hard all over the world. All these countries all over the world increasing to the point where many countries today, at least portions of those countries, rely exclusively or almost exclusively on groundwater, at least for basic needs and so on, for health, hygiene, municipal use, and so on. So this is, they're starting to regulate. Countries are regulating those aquifers, those groundwater resources around the world, and thinking about all those things that I asked earlier. What's an aquifer? What's groundwater? What do we want to regulate? What about the recharge zone, the discharge zone, and all those kinds of things? And it's, they're very dependent. Well, some people say, well, look, we got lots of groundwater. In fact, we do. We have, I don't know if you can see these little dots here, little circles. That's a representation, and in South America and Australia, you don't even see the dot, but that's a representation of how much surface water we have globally. And that's in cubic kilometers, which I think is kind of mind-boggling to picture a kilometer of water as a cube. We got a lot more groundwater available. In fact, 100 times more accessible groundwater around the world. Accessible. There's a lot of groundwater that's not accessible. If you go into frozen tundra, in the Antarctic, and so on. But accessible. Lots of countries are looking to groundwater. That's their new source of water. In many cases, they're pumping without regulations. And that's, we see that in many developing countries around the world. In the US, we've got regulations. In fact, we got 50 of them, 51. Every state has their own groundwater laws. Kind of awkward. We don't have a national groundwater approach. Every state has their own approach to groundwater. But we do have regulations. But in the states are starting to, they have thought about confined, unconfined, recharge, non-recharging aquifers. And they are regulating. They are regulating them. So one more level of complication. And this is sort of where the talk really, to me, gets interesting, because how do you deal with everything I just said when you have two sovereign countries where the aquifer crosses that boundary? And you're trying to figure out, wait, is this a confined or unconfined? Which way is the groundwater flowing? Up or down? Well, which way is up or down? Is it upstream or downstream? Well, it's up aquifer or down aquifer. Groundwater doesn't flow like a stream. A stream is two dimensions in terms of point A, point B. Groundwater is a little more complicated. And in fact, in many jurisdictions today in the US, we still rely on case law that says that it's not complicated at all. It's just mysterious. It's like the occult. And those are cases from the 1800s, 1900s, in some states where we still rely on that understanding, that level of understanding of groundwater, and we regulate it as based on those concepts: mysterious, unknowing, defying regulation. And now we want to try to do this on an international level. Well, why do we want to do this on an international level? We just saw the last slide. All these countries around the world are now becoming heavily dependent on groundwater. And they're pumping. Well, what does that have to do with international? Well, many of these aquifers are transboundary. Well, where are they? So this is a map of transboundary surface waters, or water courses. Anybody want to guess how many? You don't have to count. Any guess? How many transboundary water courses is it? I mean, how many does it look like?
75?
More than that. So we're at 273. Because there's some small ones that kind of really hard to see in here in Europe. Some tiny ones along in Africa. 273. That's the newest number. And we sometimes the numbers change because we're not sure if you count the White Nile and the Blue Nile is just the Nile, or is it two distinct rivers? And so it really depends on who you're asking, but that's approximately the number of international water courses. And you know, you get satellites, you get maps, you can figure this out. How many international agreements do you think we have on all these transboundary rivers and lakes?
2.
One? For rivers and lakes? Really? That's, you guys are that pessimistic or skeptical that we, humanity, can develop rivers and lake agreements? In fact, 3,600 treaties that we've counted. So, and that's since about 800 AD. Navigational agreements on rivers and lakes. And in the last 125 years, non-navigational uses. That's the big one right now. Non-navigational uses. Taking water for irrigation, taking water out for municipal use, for drinking, all the non-navigational stuff. That's where the action is right now. So that's surface water. This is the stuff we've been relying on for thousands of years for our basic needs. Except for the last 50 or 60 or 70 years, we've really started to see a shift to groundwater. So, moving to groundwater. The big circles are, we have 2 global water courses agreements, 2 international, now all the other ones, the little red dots, those are bilateral, multilateral agreements. 3,600 of them. 2 big international agreements. How about groundwater? Anybody want to guess how many aquifers, transboundary aquifers? No guesses? You're stumped by the last one?
5.
360.
5, 360. Keep going. Well, the real answer is, I don't know. We started counting about 15 years ago. We're up to 600 and counting. Transboundary aquifers, we're up to 600 and counting. And it's kind of hard to see on this map, but we're not really good at identifying all the ones in Asia. We just don't have a lot of information. We just don't. And so we're still counting. And this is being done, the International Groundwater Research Assessment Center, which is now part of UNESCO. They've been compiling all this information and data for the last 10, 15 years. Okay, so next question. How many agreements? We had 3,600 agreements for transboundary rivers and lakes. How many for groundwater? Transboundary aquifers? 1. Anybody want to go for 2? How about 3? I can count on one hand. So it's one hand, yes. Yeah, there's here's the one main one. That's the Genovese Aquifer. That's the only true management allocation agreement in the world. That's the only one. Genovese Aquifer. We've got these kind of yellowish green ones. These 2 are data sharing agreements in North Africa. The one here, USMexico, and the one here, Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Those are agreements not to pump. That's all the agreements. We will not pump. Let's see. We've got one here on the Guarani in South America. It's a it's a bare bones framework agreement, but they haven't ratified it yet. So it's kind of just sitting there on the shelf, not moving at all. And then I found 2 MOUs. They're not legal in that sense, but they're sort of, we'll be nice to each other, we'll agree to data share, cooperate, but you can't enforce it. That's it. Why do we have so few transboundary groundwater agreements as compared to surface water agreements? Remember that whole science part at the beginning? And that learning curve and trying to picture what does an aquifer look like? What should we regulate? This is where we are right now globally. We're at that stage trying to figure out what do we regulate? What is the thing that we're trying to control or manage or allocate? And by the way, we've got to educate the legislators, the lawyers, the judges about this thing. Because the scientists, they seem to know what it is, what groundwater is. But we haven't quite transferred that knowledge to the regulators, the legislators, very well. Let me give you a case study as an example. United States, Mexico. I mean, this is a really friendly relationship compared to someplace in the world. Lots of data and information. I mean, the U.S., we got United States Geological Service, EPA, all these organizations that are data-driven, right? Long, arid border. When you, in this Texas portion of the border, you've got the Rio Grande. So most of the folks that live in that border area of the Texas, northeastern Mexico, they rely on the Rio Grande. But from that El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, and westward, it's almost exclusively groundwater. There's a few rivers, but very few, and they don't follow the border, they just cut across the border. Almost every other sister city and community along there is dependent on groundwater resources. So where are the aquifers on the border? Remember your 7th grade geography class? You know, when you learn about maybe your state, maybe US geography, and you get these really beautiful maps here, right? With all sorts of colors. It's just gray up here and gray down here. Mexico does the same thing. And they don't talk. And we don't talk. So trying to match these boundaries together is really, really a challenge. And we don't know where all the aquifers are definitively on the border. This is something that's still being developed. I found official sources. The Good Neighbors Environmental Board, which is the USMexico coordinated effort, they say 20. Stephen Mummy, who's been studying this for 30 years, he had an article about 15, 20 years ago. He counted 18, 10. UNESCO says 8. This is the latest UNESCO map. I think it has 11 on there. I mean, it seems to be, nobody seems to know. This is the data gap where we're struggling when we're trying to regulate something, but we don't even know where it is or what it is. This is the challenge we're facing around the world. This is just an example from the US. So on top of trying to find where all these aquifers are, well, this is El Paso. We were depleting the aquifer tremendously. This is pumping rates. The water table in that El Paso Ciudad Juarez was dropping 100 feet. I can't remember the time frame, 20, 30 years. They've since have sort of slowed down the pumping, at least on the US side. But the depletion rates are, well, I can't even tell you what the depletion rates are because we don't have hard data all across the border. Remember, this is the United States. Most developed country, best information, base resources. We don't know. Pollution, we know they're polluted. There's actually a number of surplus sites right on the border. These are the Superfund sites where we know there's contamination. The contaminated, we're going to try to tag somebody and get them to pay for it, but right now we're trying to clean up the site, and it's right over an aquifer. And so we know we've got groundwater that's contaminated all along the border. A study I worked on real recently trying to address this on US-Mexico border. Just run this real quickly. We were trying to get information about the aquifers on the border because we were just trying to locate them, trying to characterize them. This is all the initial information we were trying to collect, which is all the stuff I've been suggesting we need. We actually found 36 potential aquifers on the US-Mexico border. Now you notice it's reasonable, some, and limited information. So we're confident about 16, and there's another 20 that we think are there. But remember that US map, that Mexico map? We can't connect them. Why? Well, either there's no data on one side, the other side that says an aquifer, but Mexico says an aquifer, but US doesn't say anything. So we don't know if there's a transboundary aquifer. Or they use different methodologies. And so we're trying to, it's like putting a jigsaw puzzle together where the pieces don't fit. And so we don't know where the boundaries are because the two countries use different approaches, different methodologies. So that's why under our study, we found 16 definite, another 20 maybes. Here's the map we published actually a couple months ago, one of the maps. And this is a project we're still working on. Guys, this is probably one of the most advanced bit of information we have of transboundary aquifers worldwide. We just don't have a lot of information. And if you remember before, we're pumping, we're becoming more dependent on groundwater, we're increasing our exploitation, and we don't know what the consequences are. We're not counting, we're not monitoring, we're not doing all these things. This is a university study. This is not a USGS study. This is not a governmental study. We decided to do this on our own. It's not being done at that level where in my opinion, it needs to be, so that we start getting a handle on how much water do we have going into the future. The border area is really arid. Do they have enough water to last in 20 years, 10 years, 50 years? I don't know. Nobody seems to know the answer to those. There are aquifers like the Hueco Bolson under El Paso Associated Waters that has been studied intensely. They know that aquifer very well. They've got great modeling for that aquifer. Maybe the San Pedro aquifer. That's Arizona, Sonora. That's it along the US-Mexico border. You think about it, if that's as far as we got here on our border, what about all those aquifers in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so on? Oh yeah, we do have, I mentioned we did have the one agreement not to pump off one aquifer between US and Mexico. This is a small aquifer in western Arizona, western Sonora. We will, they agree not to limit withdrawals, pending the development of, well, there's going to be prior consultation, but there's another provision here that says pending the development of a border-wide agreement, 1973, nothing since. That's the state of US-Mexico groundwater relations. So this is a case study that, in all, in best light, this is one of the better case studies from around the world. We just don't have good data, good information. So now, where does that leave us in terms of international law? We know a little bit about groundwater now. We know we need to regulate it, to manage it, to maybe sustainably regulate it. But we need all this data and information. We've got it for some aquifers within our jurisdictions, not all, and we certainly don't have it along the borders. In many countries, maybe parts of Europe are an exception, but most of the world, we really just don't have this information. So the next question is, where does it leave us with in terms of international law? These are the agreements, official agreements, unofficial agreements that I've been able to track down globally. That's it. MEDA 242, I just mentioned. The Genovese Convention, the Nubian and Northwestern Sahara, these are the two agreements, the data sharing agreements in Northern Africa, and the DC Aquifer. This is Saudi Arabia and Jordan. That's the one hand, that's all the formal agreements we have between countries. EU groundwater directive, so you have the European Union has a mechanism where they have the council developing rules that are supposed to be applied throughout all member states of the European Union. Sort of like a informal treaty, but it's mandatory on members of the European Union. This Eulamated Aquifer system, that's, as I mentioned, in Western Africa, that's MOU. It's being discussed, debated right now. And the Waterley Agreement, that's not been ratified. That's kind of sitting on the shelf right now. The only one I want to highlight here is this separate UN International Law Commission draft articles. So in 2002, the UN decided, we need to look forward, and we need to start thinking about what would law look like between countries for transboundary aquifers. They set up this commission, this panel within the International Law Commission. I was asked to serve as one of the advisory board, and we spent about 6 years brainstorming, working with countries, representatives, saying, what do you think rules should look like? We own it. It's under our ground. It's not over there. It's only domestic. It's not transboundary. We don't need international law. We can deal with it on a state-to-state basis. Those are the kinds of issues we have to deal with. Those are the kinds of arguments you have to deal with in terms of trying to develop some basic framework, some basic structure for law. And I will tell you, we didn't get very far. There are draft articles, but they're draft, and they're sitting in the UN General Assembly right now, and I don't know if they're going to go anywhere, because countries are not willing to adopt them because they've never even test-driven them. So they don't know what to do with these draft articles. And many of these countries, most of these countries, are pumping from their aquifers on the border. It's a very awkward situation, but this is the state where we're in right now. The best I can say, those 5 agreements that are official, those couple other handful of MOUs, unofficial agreements, informal arrangements, suggest that we've got a couple of procedural trends, and I'm just calling these trends towards international law. Regular exchange of data and information. Countries that have entered into an agreement, formal and informal, they seem to exchange information, and they seem to create obligations to exchange information. So maybe we can call that a trend towards a legal obligation under international law. I don't know if 5 examples make a trend, but how many countries do we have? We have close to 200 countries in the world. 5 examples, I don't know. Monitoring. Countries agree to monitor conditions of the aquifer, to develop new information about the flow direction, if it's confined, the pressure, if it's unconfined, the direct rate of infiltration and recharge, and those kinds of issues, water quality, and so on. And prior notification. We will inform you if we intend to do anything with this aquifer that might have a transboundary impact. That's what prior notification means. And most of these agreements, just this few handful, they have these procedural obligations. Now they have some other obligation rules as between those countries, but they're one-offs. You find 1 example or 2 examples of a particular norm or concept, and I can't call that a trend. Substantive rules. Well, you understand the difference between substantive law and procedural law. Procedures, you must take a certain course of action, where substantive, it creates, it's supposed to create hard and binding obligations leading to liability, responsibility. If you don't do it, you're in violation. I don't have anything other than the general international law obligation to cooperate. There's not much there from these agreements. Very little state practice, only a handful of instruments. Most of these principles have not been tested, and you've got a bunch of academics that kind of are throwing out suggestions, like me. But the Genovese Aquifer Agreement was signed in 1978. It was reauthorized in 2008. The Jordan-Saudi Arabia Agreement was created last year, brand new, out of the blue. Nobody expected it. It came out. The Guarani Agreement was drafted in 2008-9. It was signed in 2010. Yes, it's on the shelf, but it's a recent creation. The Ultimatum Agreement, it's that MOU in Western Africa. They started in 2000, they had a 2009 version, then they shelved it. There's a 2014 version, very progressive. countries are becoming engaged right now on transboundary aquifers. We're seeing this moving forward. To some extent, they're moving blindly in terms of not having any examples to look at. They're borrowing from surface water law, but it doesn't quite fit because the way a river flows is not the same way as an aquifer flowing. They're making new rules as they come along. And we're seeing this develop right now. We're seeing the countries talk to each other, and we're trying to identify the trends as this leads to international law. Where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us with a lot of gaps in the law. And a lot of areas where I think we need to develop and think about the law in terms of how are we going to manage these transboundary aquifers, transboundary groundwater resources. So liability, harm, who has the right to use, allocation, how much, what if 30% of the aquifer physically lies in your country and 70% lies in my country? Is this the way we split it? That's not the way we do rivers or lakes. How do we manage these kinds of things? What about pollution, transboundary pollution? Much harder to remove pollution from an aquifer than it is from a river. Much, much harder. Does that mean the threshold of harm is lower for groundwater pollution? Meaning you need less harm, but because you know it's going to stay there longer, have a longer impact. Well, that lower initial threshold, I don't know. These are the things that have to be considered. Protection of the recharge zone. If you have a lot of pavement in the recharge zone, you know what happens? No recharge. Should we regulate the recharge zone? How about pollution? How about dumps in the recharge area? I mean, I don't think you want landfills in the recharge zone of an aquifer. We regulate that. Industry, agriculture. These are the things that now countries are starting to think about. As I said, we're right at the cusp. We're seeing the law start to develop, and countries are talking to each other. The very fact that the UN International Law Commission was tasked with drafting those draft articles. They're not the UN General Assembly. Yes, they're kind of sitting there, but this is the start. This is how we begin. And if you want to know more, I've got some articles up here that I've written over the years. I'm still writing about this. As I said, I'll make my slides available. And you guys are welcome to the slides and check out these articles. Where to end this? I don't know. This is just the start of the journey, and it's going to take hundreds of years. You saw 3,600 treaties for surface water since 800 AD. Right? That's a long time. Well, this is the type of journey we're on to develop rules, regulations for transboundary groundwater resources. So, thank you. Any questions? Yeah. Please.
I was curious about the level of certainty required to move forward. The way you described the border between from Texas over to California sounded pretty dire, but then the chart, the map showed lots of green, which was reasonable data. So I'm wondering what you've seen with the 5 that exist, or what you see moving forward with the Mexico-U.S. border.
So you're talking about the U.S.-Mexico border map that we created, right? The level of certainty whether an aquifer exists or not.
Right, how much of it's shared, or what are those boundaries? How certain do we need to be about the boundaries to actually move forward?
It's a great question because there's no rules defining levels of certainty. We as academics, we just decided where that boundary is in terms of certainty, uncertain. This kind of study hasn't been done before. So trying to figure out, and remember, this is just for aquifer boundaries. It's not for quantity or how long, or what the sustainable rate or use of that water or that aquifer is. How long will it last? We're just trying to find the geographic contours so that then we can say, okay, if these are the contours, now we can at least start maybe getting some well data or some satellite data about how much water is in there, which way is it flowing, what's the water quality, and so we can start to what we call characterize the aquifer, and then we can start projecting into the future. How long will it last? Who, what rates of extraction, and so on. We're at such a basic level right now. Where are they? So that then we can go in and start developing this other information. So yes, there are aquifers along the U.S.-Mexico border in that really arid part west of El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. That doesn't tell me how much water is there and how long will that water last. And is it already contaminated or not? We're just trying to find geographically, because you can sink a well and you may get water, but that doesn't tell you how long it's going to last or the quality or anything of that nature. So not a direct answer, but hopefully that responds. Yes, John?
I'm wondering if you would willing to characterize the severity of the threat, either on a local basis, or a national basis, or a regional basis, or a worldwide basis, that we're going to face a dramatic shortfall in usable groundwater supplies. And I guess the question is, you made the point that we've begun mining groundwater in very recent history. And I guess my question is, do we face a brick wall in certain locations? How imminent is that? Is it already occurring? And how in the world are we going to cope with that?
So the basic question, do we have enough water? The short answer is, yeah, we got lots of water. Look at all that water in the ocean. We've got water, but it's not always where we want it and in the quality we want it. We can desalinate it, but that's expensive, takes up a lot of energy. It's also in the ocean, not in Central Asia, the really arid part of Asia. It's not in the American Southwest, where we would need that water. So we have lots of water. Canada, my God, they've only got like 30, 35 million people. They got tons of water. But we need it in the Middle East. We need it in the American Southwest. We need it in Central Asia. We need it in India. We need it in China. So geographic location is a challenge. Do we try to move water? It's really expensive. Water is heavy. It's very expensive to move. I just don't see that we're going to be transporting water great distances. So to your question, are there shortages? Is there scarcity? What's the level of threat? It's going to be very regional. It's going to be very localized. So if we're talking about India, they're already at that point where they are in a very, very low water per capita stress level. We're talking about parts of the Middle East. Talking about Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, their level where they are suffering. Now, do you have the technology to desalinate? Well, Israel has now built 5 or 6 massive desalination plants on the Mediterranean. They have the resources, they have the technology, they're doing it. Well, they don't have it, they have to. What about Jordan, Palestinians? Some of these other countries, they don't have the resources. The Saudis are desalinating. The Saudis are decided they're going to take one more step. They're going to say, you know what? Let's not grow stuff here that takes up a lot of water. Let's buy land in Arizona and California. And the Chinese are buying land in Africa, and they're growing stuff over there using the local water resources, then shipping off their goods back home. So the threats is really complicated. It's going to be very localized, regionalized, and some countries are going to be able to withstand it better than others. On a global basis, it's really hard to conceptualize, the threat level. But I will say one thing: climate change is going to have a massive effect on groundwater resources because it's precipitation. And they generally say the drier places get drier, the wetter places get wetter under climate change. Look at all the population centers we have in really dry areas. In India, Mexico, American Southwest, and climate change is going to make it drier.
So with what we've seen with the Colorado River watershed and reduced flow of surface water actually affecting groundwater. I don't know to what extent that is seen in many other jurisdictions, but is that causing some sort of interplay between surface water regulation and groundwater regulation?
Yeah, I didn't even bring up this whole conjunctive management issue or the interrelation between surface and groundwater. That's a whole nother level of complication in terms of how do you regulate it. We can have the law of the hypercycle if you want. That would be pretty complicated though. You know, trying to regulate surface water in relation to groundwater when you know that there is a hydraulic relationship, one feeds the other. Well, the complication is you can have a river, and in this portion of that river, it feeds an aquifer. A little further, a couple miles down, the aquifer feeds the river. Go further down, you have a completely different aquifer that is fed by the river. And so now how do you regulate these groundwater resources or surface water resources separately? And that's what we do. We have two completely different regulatory systems, legal systems around, definitely the U.S. and many other countries. We can try to regulate them together. The complication becomes, well, we can see the water flowing on the surface. It's a little more than two-dimensional, but it's a lot easier to manage and to control extraction withdrawals. Groundwater flows in 3 dimensions, and sometimes you have to add the time element to the 4th dimension. And you can sink a well in one location in an aquifer, it may not have any impact on the river. Well, why not? Well, because the aquifer is feeding the river. If you pump too fast, you may reverse that flow. Now we have that relationship. You may have 2 wells near each other that have no effect on each other because there's a lot of infiltration. There's a lot of recharge. Or you may have one well stronger than the other one, undercutting that well. A well can undercut a river. Groundwater depletion could affect the river. I mean, all these relationships are things that we understand, certainly at the science level. At the regulatory level, I don't think we have a clue. How do you regulate those kinds of relationships? There's a few states, Idaho, maybe Nevada, a couple that try to implement some kind of conjunctive approach where they do try to mix the regulations together. At least, if you're going to get a groundwater permit, what's the impact going to be on the river before you get that permit? But that's the exception, not the rule. We don't do that very well.
I was really struck by the slide on the rates of withdrawal since 1940. So many countries or regions have gone up. In Western Europe, it appears as though it's actually gone down slightly. And I'm wondering whether that's due to regulation. I have a quick separate question I'm going to squeeze in here. So the draft article for the ILC, for the draft articles on state responsibility took the 40 years. So maybe a few years in. Too much to
It's a great comparison. I'll tell you a story about that. So first, Europe. Europe, I think, is an exception to the global water scarcity struggle. More so in Northern Europe. Southern Europe is going to struggle. But they're going to be an exception globally because they have a fairly good history of cooperation. And they have a fairly good history of coordinating these environmental issues and natural resource issues and certainly water issues. The Water Framework Directive, I think, is a really fantastic example. The Helsinki, 1992 Helsinki Water Courses Treaty is another great example. And I think they'll be able to manage those resources. And what they've done is the demand has dropped because of the enhanced efficiency. They have, just as an example, they have these local arrangements between sister cities across the border that is recognized under the international law of the European Union. So these local agreements are at the level of international law and recognized, but it's part of this whole integrated system of cooperation. So what they're doing at the local level is integrated at the regional level, is integrated at the national level. It's not, top-down, centralization. It's integration, and the key word here is subsidiarity. Subsidiarity means You regulate at the lowest level of government that is reasonable and appropriate for that subject matter. And that's what they've done with water and many other things. And it seems to be working pretty well. Rest of the world, we don't always cooperate to that level. We don't have these kinds of arrangements. We certainly, I mean, US, Canada, we get along pretty well. US-Mexico, we get along pretty well. But, you know, Latin America, Africa, Asia, we don't have those kinds of relations. So Europe, I think, is kind of, that's why that trend is kind of eased up, because they become so much more efficient. Draft articles of state responsibility. I love that example because the when I was working with the International Law Commission, Ambassador Chusi Amada was the special rapporteur, and he said, "Here's what I want to do. I want to follow this draft articles of state responsibility in the sense of we present them to the General Assembly and table it. Bring it up 3 years later and get it tabled again. Bring it up 3 years later and get it tabled. Why? We don't put pressure on the countries to use these rules, but we let them. We say, here, look, they're sitting, they're tabled. You don't have to. They're not in law, but you can test drive them." And that's his whole plan from the beginning. I don't know where they're going to go. They're supposed to come up in October, back on the agenda. UNESCO is making waves about trying to get them pushed forward. I don't know if I want them to get pushed forward. I think many more countries need to test drive them. So it's a great analogy. Maybe eventually enough countries will like the rules, maybe modify some of them, but eventually those draft articles could go somewhere.
So with that, we should wrap it up. Thank you.